Hi there, this is episode 66 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International, and my name is Ian Willoughby. This time out, we've got a rather special guest for you. That's the UK Ambassador to Prague, Nick Archer. Mr. Archer has been here since early 2018, so he has of course served during the enormous change that was his country's exit from the European Union. But as you shall hear in just a moment, our conversation touches on a whole host of other areas. So this is me now talking to British Ambassador Nick Archer in this edition of Prague Talk. You've been the British Ambassador to Prague since 2018. What have been some of the most enjoyable aspects or moments of your time here in Prague?
I think the most enjoyable thing in the end is meeting the people. I mean, I arrived in Central Europe really not knowing what to expect in any regard. But I've been to Prague once and seen the architecture. What I hadn't done really was begin to get to know anybody. And it is a perpetual source of pleasure to me that I meet so many people who are both interesting and intelligent and making change, but who are also just terrifically nice, very generous, very welcoming. Maybe as the ambassador, maybe people treat me better. I'll probably never know, but I would certainly say that I get treated incredibly warmly, and then that brings up these moments.
Well, I met you quite recently at a classical music event, and you told me you had made efforts when you first came here to make connections with the Czech music world.
Yes, I did, because I love it, and I kind of suspected that it might be one of the the great aspects of life here. And actually, going back to your question about moments, it was just last week in the end, actually, that I sat down after a concert with Simon Rattle sitting next to me and Magdalena Kozina on the other side of the table. And I thought, this is just amazing. And this is actually something that, first of all, would never have happened to me in Britain. And second is one of the huge privileges of ambassadoring, which is that you can sort of stick your fingers into any number of different pies. So that'd be a good example.
You got, during your time here, a sheltered dog. How has having him or her affected your experience of living here?
Well, again, it's a bridge to people, actually. I go out for walks and I get into conversations. I've picked up a lot of a certain kind of Czech from having that dog. I mean, you start off with the entry-level question, is it a dog or a bitch? And you sort of take it from there. So it's a kind of a bond, and it's very evident in the streets of Prague now that he's more famous than I am. And there was one marvellous moment at the castle where somebody said, "Good morning, Ambassador." And I said, "Do I know you?" And she said, "Well, no, you don't. And I don't know you either, but I do know your dog."
You have two teenage sons. Have they spent much time here during your years in Prague?
Well, because I'm a brutal Englishman of a traditional kind, I sent them away to boarding schools. Actually, that delivers the kind of educational continuity that you need in my line of business. But strangely, we stayed on an extra year for various reasons, COVID, EU presidency. And it is in this last year, which they never should have had, that they've suddenly discovered Prague as a city of the night, and all summer with all kinds of friends and, kids of friends of ours. They were doing all-nighter after all-nighter. So I guess that in the end, because they were too young before, they've got the point of Prague and are now rather resentful of the fact that there isn't going to be another summer.
What have been some of the most challenging tasks you've had over the years? I presume explaining Brexit, probably over a longer period, can't have been that easy.
I would describe my time here as really having been all about Brexit and about having kind of brought the relationship through to one that was constructed and existed within the framework of being members of the European Union, to a relationship that is much more traditional in a way. It's kind of, in diplomatic jargon, bilateral. And we've had to effect that change. On your point about explaining, I think it's very simple in the end. I've always said that this was what people voted for, and the government had committed to giving people what they voted for. And what's been quite funny, interesting in the Czech Republic is quite often, not by any means all of the time, that question about Brexit will be accompanied by a wish we could have had that choice from an extraordinary range of people. Not people necessarily who would have voted to leave, but I think that people understand that we had a particular freedom, maybe as an island on the periphery of Europe, to make the decision we did, and that there are advantages associated with it.
I expect you must communicate a lot with London about the situation here in Czechia. What are the things that concern you about this country? For example, I've seen you speaking about the spread of disinformation here.
What concerns me, I have to be very clear that there's very little about the Czech Republic itself that would concern us. I mean, I personally think that this is a successful, in my experience, a happy country. It's a country that certainly went into COVID with a very strong economic position. I think it understands where it is in the world, in the European Union, in NATO, staunchly pro-Western and so on and so forth. But yeah, there are these global threats, essentially, that affect all of us, and disinformation is a massive one. And for me, the really curious thing about disinformation is that, we could agree that this is a virtual phenomenon. It exists in cyberspace. And yet, the Czech Republic's geography still seems to make a difference. That proximity to Russia, that even greater proximity to Ukraine, and I guess the history of being, a subjugated part of the Soviet Empire for so long.
3 years ago, the British Embassy in the Thun Palace in Malá celebrated its centenary. How have you found living and working in the palace?
I have found it completely fantastic. And, whilst COVID was in all kinds of ways a complete disaster, most of us who didn't lose relations or friends, and that's a very important qualifier, most of us who got through it okay, are nostalgic about some aspects of that quiet period of our lives. And it gave us an opportunity to inhabit the Thun Palace, forbidden to have anybody from outside coming to visit us, to inhabit it in a way that I don't think anyone had ever done, frankly, as ambassador. So we lived in it and got to know it in a very different way as our unchallenged, exclusive use home for 18 months, actually, which is a huge privilege.
During the communist period, it must have been a building of great interest to the local authorities. Is there any kind of sign today of the Cold War years?
Do you know, the only sign is something that you would never see, which is that actually the grand rooms that some of our listeners, I'm sure, will have visited, were formerly a floor down. So that whole public entertaining space was lifted up a floor. And the reason for that, very briefly, was that we needed to bring offices into the centre, which were formerly up against the outer wall, because the communists were able to listen to people in those outer offices. So in the end, we were thinking, where shall we put the defence section? I think particularly, the defence attaché and his people. And the only answer was, well, let's squeeze the house and increase the office space. And so that's the only consequence I can think of 50 years of communism.
From your interactions with Czechs over the last few years, what is your sense of how they tend to see the UK?
I've said that I didn't know Central Europe really at all. I'd lived in Northern Europe and I'd lived in the Mediterranean, and of course I come from Western Europe, so this was a new area. And I did not expect very much awareness of the UK at all, because we don't have some of those strong bonds that I'd experienced in Malta, where we'd been the colonial power, or indeed in Denmark, where Montgomery had liberated them in 1945, and we had a queen who was the cousin of the queen. So you come here and you think, do they know us at all? And of course you discover that actually they know us very well indeed. And whilst there's this huge stain on our reputation in the shape of the Munich Agreement, that doesn't seem to compromise an overall affection. Maybe that's naive of me. Again, maybe people are saying something to me as ambassador, but actually I think the affection here is genuine and really deep-seated. And the knowledge of Britain is, disconcertingly deep also. So that's been another one of those pleasant surprises that you were asking about at the beginning.
In my experience, many Czechs have a lot of affection for the British royal family. In the late 90s, you worked as assistant private secretary to the then Prince Charles for 3 years. Yeah. What were you actually doing with Prince Charles?
The support team basically divides up his various interests, or divided, I should say now, because as Prince of Wales, obviously he had extraordinary freedom to pursue campaigns and interests that he thought were important. And such was the level of activity that, there were 4 or 5 of us, I think sometimes, just ensuring that he was able to do what he wanted in particular areas. My areas were twofold. First of all, as the foreign office man on the team, I did all the foreign tours and foreign contacts. But then I had a domestic side to my life, which was both arts and culture, particular loves of mine. and also linked to the foreigner thing, I suppose. I looked after our relationships with non-Christian communities, with immigrant communities, across an amazing spectrum.
I'm sure many people ask you this, but what is the now King Charles like at the personal level?
He's great, and you would expect me to say that, but I mean, you couldn't do that job if you didn't basically buy in. And I'm a huge admirer of his. I admire his stamina, his single-mindedness. There's a huge amount of self-discipline doing that job day after day, year after year, until death. It's not, I think, a secret that Prince of Wales hardly drinks, he doesn't smoke, he keeps himself fit. He works incredibly hard on those public days in particular, where every encounter with a human being has to be right, because he could never afford to get impatient or so tired that that person came away feeling disappointed. And I just used to look at, particularly on a tour or on a day in Britain, one would meet hundreds of people, and he would leave each one of them feeling like they'd had a special moment.
Queen Elizabeth was on the throne for 7 decades. How difficult do you think it'll be for King Charles to succeed her, this monarch who basically is all any of us know?
I think it's kind of happened very well, and I think the succession is now a fact and an uncontroversial one, which is not in any way to set aside the colossal affection that we saw for the Queen at the moment of her death. But it is to say that almost immediately looking back, one saw that there was maybe a ripeness to the timing of her disappearing and the Prince of Wales taking over. Still young enough to do the job, but with a colossal amount of experience and wisdom derived from whatever it was, 73 years of more or less direct preparation.
Also, I'm curious, I follow you on Twitter, many people do. I presume most of your followers speak English or understand English at least. Why do you tweet in Czech?
Because I don't think that most of my followers do, actually. I mean, we talk about this quite a lot, and it's very speculative. But I think I simply get access to more people if I'm mixing quite a lot of Czech in. And you'll see that if I'm deliberately pointing at an English-speaking audience, I'll tweet in English. God knows it's a lot easier. But no, I want to be talking to Czechs, and I don't want them to be having to regard my tweet as hard work, as a kind of a bit of the English lesson.
Do you have somebody you check the Czech with, or who translates? I'm just curious how that works.
No, I check the Czech. I mean, I'm happy to admit that I use artificial translation mechanisms, but as any English speaker in this country knows, they are an absolute nightmare, because they can't, for example, distinguish genders at the most straightforward level. So my Czech is absolutely good enough for me to look at a Google Translate or whatever and think, that's not right. And then I will try and rephrase what I want to say in a way that gives me Czech I'm happy with. So I take absolutely full responsibility. And, when I get my Czech wrong sometimes, that's not kind of deliberate. That's just because clearly my system has let me down for a moment.
I've often wondered about diplomats. This is a bit of a kind of indulgence, if I may. How do you guys go to so many receptions where there's food and drink? Every evening, I presume you go to a few, or that's how it seems from the outside. How do you manage to do that without gaining weight or developing a drink problem?
I think it's an extremely good question. Do you know, when I was a very young man in London, I shared a house with a diplomat's daughter. I mean, we were in our early 20s. And he, as they said, had laid down his liver in the service of his country. So I guess I was aware. I mean, he was not a happy chap. I was aware of the risk from the start. But, I think it's a risk that exists in your profession of journalism. It's a risk that exists in my wife's profession of barristering, lawyers, that is, for Czechs listening, not a barista. And, we all exercise some self-control.
My final question, Nick Archer, in 30 years or 35 years, when you're sitting in your rocking chair back in the UK, what do you think you will remember of Prague?
I will remember the Toon Palace, certainly. I will remember the utter joy of empty Prague when COVID first hit. I will remember some diplomatic moments. I presented my credentials one February or spring afternoon, And the next morning, first thing, I was lobbying across the Czech government, having only just been allowed to talk to ministers, that credential ceremony, to try and encourage the Czech government to expel Russian diplomats because of Skripal. And there are these moments.
Many thanks indeed to Nick Archer for taking time out of his busy schedule to speak to me for episode 66 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. There are, of course, dozens of other episodes out there, so if you're new to us, why not give them a go? And do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For now, from me, Ian Willoughby, thank you very much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.